The Young and the Restless spoilers. When Jill arrived in Nice, she came with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The Mediterranean sun did little to soften the storm inside her. Billy had reached a point where every battle seemed to end in humiliation, and every attempt to rebuild his life was met with sabotage. Kane had positioned himself as both rival and executioner, pushing Billy into corners from which there seemed to be no way out. Jill could no longer sit back in Genoa City and watch her son crumble beneath the weight of another man's ambition. She told herself that this trip was about strategy and negotiation, but deep down she knew it was about something else, a mother's instinct to protect, sharpened by decades of corporate wars and personal losses. Yet the moment she set foot in the coastal city where fortunes and faces changed overnight, Jill began to feel that something was off. Kane's behavior, his presence, even his voice, carried a foreign edge, as if the soul behind the eyes didn't belong to the man she once knew. Billy had always been reckless, but this time his self-destruction felt engineered. Jill noticed the pattern: projects falling apart right before funding, allies withdrawing without warning, documents mysteriously altered to make Billy look incompetent. Kane was behind every thread, or so it seemed. But the deeper Jill looked, the less it resembled Kane's old cunning. There was precision now, a clinical cruelty that didn't fit the man she once saw struggle with guilt and redemption. Late at night, she replayed old memories: Kane's hesitation before a lie, the tremor in his voice when he begged Lily for forgiveness, the moments of humanity that had once redeemed him. The man she encountered in Nice was devoid of all that. He was colder, faster, as if someone had studied Kane and was performing him like an actor rehearsing a role. Jill couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't facing a rival from her past, but an intruder wearing the ghost of one. Her instincts sharpened when she visited the offices that Kane had recently taken over. The staff behaved like they were under hypnosis, avoiding eye contact, speaking in rehearsed tones, describing their boss as if he were a myth. Even the smallest details unsettled her: his handwriting on memos, suddenly more angular and detached, the scent of his cologne, no longer the same brand, and the scar above his jawline that used to shift slightly when he smiled, now too smooth, as though erased. Jill's mind raced between madness and certainty. Had Kane been replaced? Was this another one of Colin's twisted schemes, or something more sinister involving impersonation and corporate espionage? Every clue brought her closer to the edge of disbelief, and yet, she couldn't deny the growing evidence that the man manipulating her son was not who he claimed to be. One evening, Jill decided to confront him directly. She walked into his penthouse without knocking, her heels echoing against the marble, her eyes filled with a mix of fury and dread. Kane, or whoever he was, stood at the window overlooking the glowing city, his reflection cold and motionless. When he turned to face her, his expression was composed, but something in his posture betrayed surprise. Jill didn't wait for an invitation. She demanded answers, her voice trembling with the weight of years of betrayal. She accused him of destroying Billy's reputation, of dismantling everything he had built, and of turning what could have been forgiveness into vengeance. But as she spoke, she watched his face, or rather, the surface of it, and noticed something extraordinary: a faint seam near the edge of his neck, just beneath the collar. Her heart froze. At that moment, all the logic in the world gave way to instinct. She moved forward faster than she had in years, her hand reaching out with a force that surprised even her. Her fingers caught the edge of that seam, and with one fierce pull, the world shattered. The thin, lifelike mask peeled away, revealing a stranger beneath, a man with unfamiliar eyes, startled yet defiant. Jill stepped back, gasping not from fear but from vindication. The truth had exploded in front of her like a detonated secret. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling but unyielding. "Why are you pretending to be Kane?" The man's expression shifted between panic and calculation. He tried to cover his face, but the illusion was gone, the reality was too grotesque to hide. The skin beneath was mottled, scarred, a reconstruction of someone who had once been destroyed and rebuilt for a purpose Jill couldn't yet comprehend. As he stumbled backward, Jill felt a wave of disgust and triumph collide within her. Everything she had suspected, the lies, the coldness, the mechanical perfection, suddenly made sense. This wasn't Cain, this was a masquerade built to infiltrate every weakness in her family. The revelation was horrifying but also liberating. Now she had proof that Billy's suffering wasn't the result of his own failure, but of a larger deception. Yet even as she stood there, breathing heavily, she realized this truth opened a darker path. If this man wasn't Cain, then where was the real one? Was he dead? Kidnapped? Or complicit in his own disappearance? Jill's mind flooded with questions that had no answers yet, but one thing was certain, she was standing on the edge of something far bigger than a family feud. The man, still half-masked and trembling, tried to justify himself. He spoke of orders, of a mission, of debts owed to powerful people who wanted Newman and Chancellor alike brought down from within. Jill pieced it together, this was not random. Someone was orchestrating a long game, using this imposter to dismantle alliances, poison partnerships, and turn families into enemies. Cain's identity had become a weapon. Jill felt her blood turn to ice as she realized how deep this conspiracy ran. The same hands that had manipulated Cain's life before, perhaps even Colin's old network, could be behind this. And if they were bold enough to replace Cain, then anyone in Genoa City could be next. The mask was not just a disguise, it was a warning of how far her enemies would go to control everything. Still, she refused to be intimidated. Jill, hardened by decades of business wars and emotional scars, understood that power came not from fear but from knowledge. She recorded everything, the confession, the face, the trembling voice. Her next move would be surgical. She would return to Genoa City not as a grieving mother but as a strategist ready to expose a crime that reached beyond her imagination. Yet even as she prepared to strike back, she couldn't help but feel the echo of loss. Somewhere in her chest, the memory of the real Cain lingered, the flawed man who had once loved her son like a brother. She wondered whether he was out there somewhere, imprisoned or hiding, and whether this revelation would finally set him free or condemn him forever. When she left the penthouse, the night air of Nice felt heavier than before. The city's beauty had turned deceptive, its lights shimmering over secrets buried beneath luxury and deceit. Jill realized this wasn't the end of the war, it was merely the first act of a new one. She had torn away the mask, but the face of the true enemy was still hidden in the shadows. There would be retaliation, there always was. And when it came, it would target the one thing she had left to protect, Billy. But for the first time in years, Jill felt something that had nearly died inside her, to clarity. She now knew what she was fighting for and who she was fighting against. As dawn crept across the horizon, Jill stood by her window, clutching the torn piece of synthetic skin in her hand. It was the most grotesque proof she'd ever possessed, and the most powerful. The battle for truth had just begun, and she was ready to meet it head-on, no matter how deep into darkness it led. For the first time in a long time, Jill was not just a mother avenging her son, she was a woman confronting the ghosts of her past, peeling back every layer of deceit that had haunted Genoa City. And as the waves crashed against the shores of Nice, she whispered to herself that no mask could ever hide the truth forever, not from her, not anymore. The moment Jill tore the mask from his face, the illusion shattered like glass, but what emerged was even more terrifying than she could have imagined. The man standing before her was no mere impersonator, no corporate rival playing a role, he was Aristotle Dumas, a name whispered in criminal circles and buried in unsolved cases stretching from Sydney to Zurich. Once a brilliant mimic and identity thief, Aristotle had vanished years ago after being suspected of murdering a wealthy executive and taking his place for nearly a decade. Now the pieces aligned with horrifying precision. The real Cain had not disappeared because of guilt or exile, he had been murdered, and his body replaced by a monster who wore his life like a stolen suit. Jill's instincts had been right all along, but the truth offered no victory, only terror. Aristotle's eyes, once calm and calculating, now blazed with the madness of exposure. He lunged toward her, his voice no longer smooth but guttural, raw with fury. Jill stumbled backward, her heart pounding as she realized the danger she was in. This was no business war, this was survival. Aristotle had crafted the perfect performance for years, manipulating those who trusted Cain, infiltrating their lives, and orchestrating their downfalls for reasons even darker than ambition. Jill's discovery had detonated his empire. Now, she was the liability that needed to disappear. He whispered threats, his words laced with venom, telling her that she had seen too much, that the show must continue without her. The fear in Jill's chest turned to defiance. She grabbed a lamp, swung it toward him, shattering glass and spilling light across the floor, but Aristotle barely flinched. He smiled, that cold, false smile that now felt utterly alien, and advanced again. Meanwhile, across the city, Billy was pacing his hotel suite, restless and uneasy. Something inside him had been gnawing all evening, a son's instinct that something was terribly wrong. He tried calling his mother, but the line rang endlessly. When he reached the receptionist, he learned Jill had left hours ago to meet Cain. Panic flooded him. He knew how volatile that meeting could be, but he couldn't have imagined the nightmare unfolding. Without hesitation, Billy grabbed his coat and rushed into the night, ignoring the storm rolling over the Riviera. His mind raced through memories of Cain, the fights, the betrayals, the attempts at forgiveness, and he wondered if this was finally the breaking point that would destroy them all. Back in the penthouse, Jill's courage began to falter. Aristotle had overpowered her, slamming her against the wall as his true rage broke through the mask of civility. He confessed in fragments, his voice trembling with twisted pride. He told her that Cain had never stood a chance, that he had been lured into a trap years ago during a deal gone wrong in Australia. Aristotle had killed him and taken his face, his identity, and his life. For years, he had lived among them, manipulating the Winters family, infiltrating Chancellor, and turning every connection into a weapon. It wasn't money that drove him anymore, but the art of deception itself. To him, living as Cain had been the ultimate masterpiece, and Jill's discovery had ruined it. Now he wanted to erase her as well, to restore the illusion that had made him powerful. As Jill struggled to free herself, her mind flashed through decades of battles, every hostile takeover, every betrayal she had survived. She realized this wasn't just about saving herself, it was about preserving the truth of who her family was. With a burst of strength, she broke away, slamming her elbow into Aristotle's chest and darting for the door. But he was faster. He grabbed her by the hair, dragged her back, and hissed that she would never leave the room alive. The lights flickered as thunder shook the windows, casting monstrous shadows across the walls. Jill screamed, but the storm outside drowned her voice. She thought of Billy and wondered if he would ever forgive himself for not being there. Billy reached the building minutes later, breathless and soaked. The concierge tried to stop him, but his eyes were wild with panic. He sprinted up the stairs two at a time, heart pounding louder than the rain. When he reached the door to Cain's suite, he heard the chaos inside, furniture crashing, glass shattering, and his mother's muffled cries. Without hesitation, he rammed his shoulder into the door, breaking it open. The scene froze him in horror, Jill pinned against the wall, Aristotle's mask lying torn on the floor, and the monstrous truth staring back at him. For a second, Billy couldn't process what he saw. The man before him looked like Cain, yet not. His features were twisted, half-peeled, revealing the stranger beneath. Aristotle turned, his eyes full of hatred, and lunged at Billy. The fight that followed was brutal. Billy, fueled by fear and rage, threw punches like a man possessed, but Aristotle was stronger, trained, and consumed by desperation. The two crashed through furniture, scattering debris across the floor. Jill tried to intervene, shouting for Billy to stop, but Aristotle overpowered him, slamming him to the ground. He grabbed a shard of glass and raised it above Billy's chest, ready to strike, when Jill hurled herself at him, clawing at his face with every ounce of strength she had left. Aristotle roared, tossing her aside, but the distraction gave Billy the opening he needed. He kicked the shard from Aristotle's hand and tackled him again, sending both men crashing through the balcony doors. For a horrifying second, they teetered on the edge of the railing, the storm raging around them, before Aristotle lost his footing and fell into the darkness below. Billy pulled himself back onto the balcony, gasping, drenched, and trembling. Jill crawled toward him, sobbing in relief, but their relief was short-lived. When they looked down, there was no body. The courtyard below was empty except for the sound of rain. Aristotle Dumas, or what was left of him, had vanished into the night. The nightmare wasn't over, it had merely changed shape. The police arrived minutes later, alerted by neighbors who had heard the struggle, but by then the suite was chaos, and there was no sign of their attacker. Billy and Jill gave statements, describing everything, the mask, the confession, the attack, but the officers exchanged skeptical glances. Without proof, it sounded like a delusion. The mask had been taken, the evidence erased, as if Aristotle had anticipated every move. In the days that followed, Jill became haunted. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every shadow seemed to move, every phone call made her jump. She hired investigators to confirm Aristotle Dumas's identity, and what they uncovered chilled her blood. The man had been declared dead years ago after a supposed suicide, but his DNA appeared in multiple crime scenes afterward. He was a ghost in the system, a man who never truly existed. The question remained, why Kane? Why had he chosen that particular identity to steal? Digging deeper, Jill discovered that Aristotle and Kane had crossed paths in Australia years before. Kane had unknowingly uncovered one of Aristotle's schemes involving corporate fraud and human trafficking, and that discovery had cost him his life. Aristotle had seen an opportunity, take Kane's face, his life, his access to wealth, and vanish into legitimacy. Until Jill unmasked him, he had succeeded perfectly. Billy tried to be strong for his mother, but the ordeal left scars. He blamed himself for not believing her sooner, for letting Kane, or rather Aristotle, infiltrate their lives for so long. He became obsessed with finding him, convinced that Aristotle was still alive, waiting for another chance to strike. His paranoia grew, driving a wedge between him and everyone who tried to help. Even Lily, who had once been the heart that calmed him, withdrew in fear of what he was becoming. Jill, too, began to unravel. Her confrontation with Aristotle had awakened old traumas she thought she had buried. She started to question her own sanity, wondering if exposing the truth had been worth the cost. Weeks later, a new terror emerged. Strange packages began arriving at Chancellor Industries, small boxes with no return address. Inside each was a fragment of synthetic skin, identical to the mask she had torn from Aristotle's face. No note, no threat, just the silent message that he was still watching. Jill's hands trembled as she opened the third one. The smell of chemicals made her nauseous, but what froze her blood was the photograph inside, a grainy image of her sleeping in her hotel room, taken from just a few feet away. Aristotle had survived. He was taunting her. The realization struck like lightning. She wasn't safe, and neither was Billy. This was no longer a fight for power or justice, it was a hunt. Aristotle was still playing the game, waiting for the perfect moment to return. Jill knew that if she didn't stop him soon, she would be next. But even as fear consumed her, another feeling grew stronger, resolve. She had faced ruthless businessmen, blackmailers, and traitors, but never something this monstrous. Yet she was still Jill Abbott, the woman who built empires out of ashes. She refused to die a victim. She would find Aristotle, expose him, and end this masquerade once and for all, even if it cost her everything. As the sun set over Nice, the waves below crashed violently against the rocks, echoing the storm still raging inside her. Somewhere in the shadows, Aristotle watched, his disfigured face hidden beneath a new mask, his mind already crafting the next deception. The war between them was far from over, it had merely entered a new phase, one where truth and illusion would bleed together until no one could tell which face was real.